The Flame of Gilliad. 1. Chavella, priestess of the Temple of Gilead, woke with a start, her opulent blue eyes fluttering open. It was the rapid knocking on her chamber door that had roused her from a deep slumber. A moment later she heard the frantic voice of Vanar, the temple's high priest. "Chavella, wake up!" he said urgently. "It is Vanar." Brushing aside her lush golden blonde hair, she glanced at the long flickering candles on her bedside table. She knew it must be after midnight, for they had melted much, and the wax had pooled and solidified at the base of the brass candle-holder. Hastily she scampered out of bed. Wearing naught but a simple, short-sleeved night-tunic of white cotton, she covered her slender figure in a brown wool robe and rushed to the door. Unlatching a clasp, she slid back a small metal cover through which she could see the familiar face of Vanar. "Chavella," he said excitedly, "open the door! You must come with me quickly!" Chavella could see that the priest was in an agitated state and looked nearly panic-stricken. "What is wrong?" she asked in a voice fraught with concern. "The temple has been broken into, and murder has been committed this night," answered the priest. "Now quickly, open your door," he urged. "Your very life may depend on it." Vanar's words smote Chavella like a physical blow. "Murder?" she exclaimed in shock. "Who?" And without hesitation she drew back the heavy iron bolt that secured her chamber door. In that instant a giant of a man garbed in black clothing burst through the doorway and seized her roughly in his massive arms. The unexpected attack took her by surprise, and in fear she attempted to scream. But before she could, a huge hairy hand was clamped over her soft pink lips, stifling her cry for help. She struggled futilely for a moment against the great brute, but his vice-like grip only tightened, bruising her delicate white skin. A helpless captive, she could do nothing but watch as Vanar entered her room. Closing the door behind him, he slid the iron bolt home and turned his eyes upon her. The face of fright he had so prominently displayed just a few moments before was gone, replaced by a look of unmistakable menace. This was something she had never seen on the priest's normally kind and placid features. As he leveled his cold, piercing gaze at her, he spoke. "Priestess, I am going to allow you to speak. But know this, if you make any attempt to scream or conjure the jewel that you carry, I will have Baltos slit your pretty throat." A second later she felt the cold edge of a knife press against the soft flesh of her neck. And as it was placed there, she could feel the hot, stinking breath of the man holding it, and it repulsed her. Removing his hand, Chavella gasped for air, her bosom heaving. She was confused and shocked by Vanar's actions, a person whom she loved, a person who had helped raise her and mentor her since childhood. "What is the meaning of this, Vanar?" she demanded in a voice quivering with the intense emotions of raw fear and anger. The priest laughed and smiled cruelly at her, and suddenly, before her disbelieving eyes, the man she thought to be Vanar slowly vanished as a wisp of grey smoke dissipates. Before her stood a man in a purple velvet robe who was unfamiliar. With dusky-hued skin, high defined cheekbones, and cold, slanted black eyes, he looked akin to a vulture. For a moment Chavella stood utterly dumbfounded, hardly believing that Vanar had been nothing more than an illusion. Recovering her wits, she said, "Where is Vanar?" Yet she feared that she already knew the answer. "He is dead," replied the man in a matter-of-fact tone. And as he spoke, his voice now carried a strange accent that was no longer masked with illusion. "I offered him an opportunity to help with my plans in exchange for his life, but the fool refused." Tears welled in Chavella's eyes at the thought of Vanar, and in a shaky voice she said, "Who are you?" "I am Zuthal Ka, High Priest of Baal. Perhaps you have heard of me." The icy hand of panic gripped Chavella, and fear suddenly grew in her eyes as a shudder ran down her spine at the recognition of that name. She had indeed heard of Zuthal Ka, and knew that he was the leader of a large and fanatical cult, a congregation who worshipped the vile demon god Baal. Over the past several years, Zuthal Ka and his followers had grown in numbers and strength. In the city of Kem there stood the mighty temple of Baal with its towering columns of black marble and great vaulted rooftop. Stories abounded of strange and abstruse rituals held deep in the night in that shadow-haunted shrine. They told of hooded priests and votaries gathering in conclave, wearing bestial masks, and how, amid fire and flame, they performed horrific sacrifices as chained victims were dragged screaming to the altar as blood offerings to Baal. All of this Chavella had heard, and it froze the blood in her veins. "And what do you want with me?" she said in a voice that shook with fright. Zuthal Ka gazed at Chavella. Stepping closer, he lightly brushed his long-nailed hand across her soft, delicate cheek. To Chavella, that touch was like the rasp of a serpent, and she recoiled in disgust. "You are as beautiful as tales tell, priestess. You truly are the goddess of Gilead, as the people have so named you." Charvella's ivory cheeks suddenly flared red, and her luxurious eyes blazed like coals of blue fire. "That is blasphemy," she retorted as she glowered angrily at Zuthal Ka. "I am no more a goddess than you are a god." Amused at her display of unbridled fury, the priest chuckled. "Enough of this trivial nonsense," he muttered as his laughter faded. "I have no time to admire your attributes, beautiful as they may be. You know what I want. I want the jewel you carry within you, the one they call the Flame of Gilliad. And I want its secrets." "Never!" she retorted defiantly, struggling against her giant captor as her cheeks flushed an even brighter shade of fiery crimson. "You will have to kill me to get the jewel, and if you do, you will never learn its secrets." Zuthal Ka gazed at the priestess as an adult looks upon a naive child. "I do not intend to kill you," he said with a wry smile. "At least, not until I have what I desire. But I will have the jewel," he said with certainty. "And you may well wish I had killed you. Long did it take me to learn the whereabouts of Gilead's flame. Legend says it vanished from the knowledge of man long ago, but with the aid of cosmic sorcery, I have spoken to dark and shapeless beings that dwell on the outer fringes beyond this world. And I know that the jewel rests within you, and only you can conjure it." Chavella made no reply as she stared at Zuthal Ka. Her blue eyes were bloodshot, and her cheeks glistened with the tears she had cried. "You will come to the city of Kem with me," continued the priest, "to my temple. Once there, you will conjure forth the jewel and teach me its secrets." He then paused for a moment, as if realizing something. "But alas," he continued, "I fear that we do not have time for further discussion. The hour grows late, and we must return to Kem. But before we go, I will ensure that you make no attempt to escape." Zuthal Ka then grasped her slender wrist. At the moment of contact, she felt a tingling sensation that spread rapidly through her body. An instant later, her muscles went slack, and she would have fallen save for the giant brute holding her. She tried to voice her anger, but found that her power of speech had been paralyzed as well. "Come now, Balto," ordered Zuthal Ka. "We must be off." And as easily as if he were lifting a child, the giant placed Chavella over one massive shoulder like a sack of grain. Zuthal Ka unbolted the door, and they stole furtively down a corridor lit by flickering candles and copper wall-mounted lamps. Though alive and bustling with acolytes, priests, and worshippers during the day, the temple was nearly deserted at night. Like a fortress, it was locked a few hours after sunset, and only a handful of guards and priests remained. They had not gone far when Chavella noticed the figures of two men she recognized as guards lying prone on the stone floor. One lay face down, his head twisted in an unnatural and grotesque angle. The other was on his side in a pool of dark blood. Chavella could see as they passed that both still had their longswords in their scabbards and apparently died without a chance to fight. At an intersection, Zuthal Ka turned right into a long hallway lined with ivory doors. Chavella knew that this particular passageway led to the temple's rear portico and courtyard. As they advanced down the hallway, they came upon another body that Chavella realized was Vanar, the high priest. He lay on his back with his glazed eyes staring blankly, and a great stain of blood on his chest that soaked through his robe. Seeing the lifeless priest, Chavella felt a rush of great sadness followed by a wave of nausea that threatened to make her sick. A moment later they came to a large wooden door hung with stout brass hinges and secured with a thick iron-wrought latch. Lifting the latch, Zuthal Ka grasped the worn brass handle and swung the door open. They were greeted with a blast of chill night air and the gray glow of a crescent moon. Stealthily they crossed the plush grass-covered courtyard, and presently Chavella heard the sound of a horse whinny. Skirting an outcropping of trees, they came around a long row of finely manicured hedges. Behind these, hidden from view, were two large horses hitched to a two-wheeled cart. It was here that the giant unceremoniously dumped Chavella and covered her with a thick wool blanket. Still unable to move or scream, all she could do was wait to see what fate had in store for her. A moment later, her captors climbed atop the cart and were seated. Gathering the reins, Zuthal Ka snapped them like a whip. The cart lurched forward, and they sped off through the darkened courtyard with a clattering of hoofs. 2. The next morning, news of Chavella's abduction and the murder of Vanar spread quickly among the temple's clergy. In the cella, priests and acolytes had gathered in mass. Shaken by the terrible events, they sat with heads bowed and eyes closed, mumbling prayers before the massive carven image of Gilliad. Wrought from white marble, Gilliad was depicted as a tall man in a flowing robe, with long hair and a face of nobility and kindness. Among the gathered ecclesiastics, there were 3 priests that sat apart from the rest and were deep in conversation. "Chavella's abduction must be kept a secret for now," said Roland, a short man of considerable girth with a large pudgy face and a cleanly shaven head. "We do not want the citizens to know, not yet." "What are we going to do?" asked Misha, a short and petite priestess with dark, closely cropped hair and brown eyes that reflected her concern. "We cannot keep this a secret for long. A few days at best, and then people will begin to wonder." "We must consult the oracle," said Roland. "But Chavella is taken," retorted Misha, "and Vanar is dead. They were the oracles, and it was only through them that we could commune with our god. Only they had the power to evoke our deity." "That responsibility now falls on the shoulders of Sabian," replied Roland, as he looked at the third priest who had remained in silent prayer during the conversation. "You are now the high priest of the Temple of Gilliad," he said, as he placed a reassuring hand on Sabian's robe-covered shoulder. Opening his eyes, Sabian glanced at his colleagues, his kind brown eyes and handsome aquiline features plainly showing his concern. Though he was approaching middle age, he had not expected to become the high priest for several more years, at least not until Vanar chose to abdicate his position. But now the unexpected death of his friend and mentor and the kidnapping of Chavella had thrust him into a position that he was not overly confident he could handle. "It is a duty that I reluctantly accept, and worry that I am unfit to fulfill. But at all cost we must find and rescue Chavella, for she is the true strength that binds this congregation." An hour later, the cella had been cleared of all worshippers, and its doors were closed and locked. Only Sabian, Roland, and Misha remained. All 3 were garbed in long ceremonial robes of cloth of gold and red vermilion, secured with cinctures of golden cloth wrapped about their waists. As they prepared for the summoning, a phial of beaten gold embossed with silver was laid out on the altar before the towering stone image of Gilliad. Into this vessel the ritual libation of red wine was poured in offering to Gilliad, and from it each of the priests drank. Sabian then took his position on the floor before the statue of Gilliad, while Misha and Roland were seated facing him. For a long while Sabian sat cross-legged, chanting prayers of invocation in a strong, resonant voice that echoed throughout the room. Then suddenly the atmosphere took on an aspect of tension, and Sabian's invocations abruptly ceased, and a deep silence fell over the room. Opening their eyes, Roland and Misha gazed at Sabian, who was sitting upright, rigid as stone. Suddenly his eyes opened wide, radiating a lurid blue brilliance, and his body shook and swayed. The moment his chanting ceased, Sabian suddenly felt as if he were being pulled across an endless black void at terrific speed. And then, abruptly, he found himself in a great room, with walls that shone with a silver radiance. In the center of that room sat the huge form of Gilliad on a great throne of jade and silver, swathed in a robe of gold and vermilion. Sabian knelt before the deity with his head bowed. "Rise, my votary," said Gilliad in a deep metallic voice that filled the room. Standing, Sabian looked upon his god, and his mortal mind could hardly grasp what he saw. Gilead's eyes blazed a topaz blue, his skin and long hair were milk-white, and his face was of an unearthly, almost incomprehensible beauty. Gilliad gazed down at the priest and spoke. "Sabian, priest of my temple, long have you been worthy and devout, and I welcome you into my house." "The honor is all mine, my liege," replied Sabian in a voice that sounded weak and feeble. Gilliad then stood from his throne, towering above Sabian. "Know that I have seen all that has transpired. Chavella has been taken by the dark sorcerer Zuthal Ka and brought to his forbidden temple. Go now to the city of Kem and make haste. Chavella does not have long. Go into the streets and seek the one called Rinbon, for if there is a mortal man that can save her, it is he." Sabian sat silent for a moment in thought as Gilead seated himself on his throne. "Now go, O man, for you have no time to remain. Chavella must be rescued, or the world will suffer a dark fate." And instantly Sabian felt the familiar rush as he was pulled back across the black void, back to his own world. As Roland and Misha watched, Sabian's body suddenly went slack, and the bright blue radiance that blazed in his eyes faded. With a gasp he came back to full consciousness. "What has happened?" asked Misha. "We are to depart for the city of Kem within the hour," said Sabian. He then stood from the floor and began removing his ceremonial robe with alacrity. "There we are to find Rinbon." "Rinbon?" said Roland, with a look of disbelief and a puzzlement on his face. "The Prince of Thieves?" "Yes," replied Sabian. "That is what Gilead has commanded." 3. A roar of wild laughter, mingling with profane curses, rose to the smoke-stained rafters of the small tavern. In a corner, illuminated by the flickering orange flames from a soot-blackened hearth, a dozen men squatted, tossing ivory dice against a stone wall. At each throw, scarred and calloused hands exchanged glinting coins of copper and silver, plucked from leather pouches. And as they gambled, the roisterers sang obscene songs and drank deeply, thrusting their faces into huge drinking jacks of frothy ale, or swilling wine and rum from earthen jars. They were hard men, with quick wolfish eyes. A motley collection of nimble-fingered thieves and hard-eyed pirates, with loops of gold hanging from their ears and cloth sashes wrapped around their heads. Most of them wore the cheap standard garb of the day: soft leather breeches, gray or brown cotton shirts with burnished brass buttons, and low-topped leather boots. Daggers and swords with worn hilts hung openly from brass-buckled belts, and all bore the scars of a hard life. Though small and dingy and reeking of smoke and stale wine, this particular alehouse was popular among the men of the Thieves' Guild and their ilk. However, most of the common folk shunned the place, considering it nothing more than a hangout for villainous cutthroats. Among this wild and ragged bunch of ruffians, there was one man who stood out in vivid contrast, like a king among beggars, or perhaps a serpent among rats. Unlike the others, his white silk shirt, adorned with glittering silver buttons, and plush leather breeks were of the finest quality, as were his high-topped buckskin boots. From his hip hung a curved ivory-hilted cutlass in a silver gilt-worked scabbard. The hilt, inlaid with dazzling rubies and emeralds, sparkled at the slightest movement. On his fingers he wore an array of gleaming gold and silver rings, and from his ears hung loops of purest silver. By his attire he looked as if he should be attending a grand ball or banquet at the behest of some aristocrat or king, not tossing dice in a dingy den with dissolute criminals. In stature he was leanly built and tall, but not bulky or overly muscled. His every movement was fluid and subtle, almost delicate, not jerky or unsure. Yet this casual ease of movement belied steel spring muscles and reflexes that could blur the eye. His facial features were finely chiseled and handsome, with a straight nose, a tousled shock of chestnut brown hair, and intelligent brown eyes. This was Rinbon, whom they called the Prince of Thieves, a man whose daring deeds were lauded by poets and celebrated in songs and ballads. Such was his fame that the stories of his adventures were recited in the grimiest of taverns and in majestic palaces before the mightiest of kings. The fact that Rinbon displayed such gaudy wealth openly stood as a testament to his reputation. In this part of the city, most would fear a knife in the back from a robber, but not Rinbon. He was among friends, thieves and villains though they may be. These men revered him, and would have gladly fought to the death for him. Moreover, everyone knew that any affront towards Rinbon would be met with immediate retaliation by the Thieves' Guild. Being a high-ranking member and the favorite of the guildmaster had its advantages. Rinbon laughed mightily as he gulped sweet red wine from a clay jug and lost another throw of the dice. "Pay up," said a dark-eyed thief with a crooked, toothy grin as he took the copper pieces that Rinbon tossed to him. "It seems as though my luck has run out," said Rinbon. "My pouch was bulging like an overfilled wineskin when first I came in, but now it seems to have sprung a leak, or perchance one of you robbers has filched my coins." And indeed his sagging pouch hardly made a sound as he shook it, the few remaining coins clanking weakly. The men, roaring with unabandoned mirth at the thought of Rinbon losing, suddenly fell silent, their eyes looking past their object of humor. Turning, Rinbon noticed that two men garbed in the vestments of priests had approached and were presently standing with arms folded in their long brown robes. It was clear to him, by the looks on their faces, that they were a trifle nervous. It was also clear that, in this hovel of ill repute, they were as out of place as the men who gathered in it would have been in a holy temple. Bowing low, one of the men stepped forward and said nervously, "We are looking for the one they call Rinbon. We were told that he frequents this establishment often." Hauling himself up, Rinbon's hand went instinctively to the ivory hilt of his sword as he eyed the two men suspiciously. "And who are you?" asked Rinbon curiously. Behind him, the rest of the men climbed to their feet, their hard eyes and scarred faces glaring at the robed figures as their hands groped for the hilts of daggers and knives. In a stammering voice the man said, I am Sabian, High Priest of the Temple of Gilliad, and this is Roland," he said, indicating the rotund man that stood next to him. "We have come from the city of Tanalone, and we are in need of his help." Sensing that the man was sincere and meant him no harm, Rinbon relaxed a bit and removed his hand from the hilt of his sword. This gesture was noted by the two priests, and they seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "Well, you have come to the right place. I am Rinbon. But pray tell, why would two priests travel all the way from Tanalone seeking my help? You are men of the clergy and serve a god. I am a thief and adventurer. What madness is this?" "It is a long story," replied Sabian, "and one that I would prefer that only you were privy to, for we have great need to keep what we have to say secret. May we sit and talk in private?" "Aye. said Rinbon, motioning to one of the empty tables in a dim, secluded corner. With a look to his friends indicating that their knives and daggers would not be needed, the group went back to gambling, and Rinbon seated himself, placing his jug of wine on the table. "What we have to tell you," said Sabian in a low voice, "may sound unbelievable, but I assure you that all I speak is truth. You have heard of Chavella, the keeper of the Flame of Gilliad?" "Aye," replied Rinbon. "Everyone knows the story. She had within her a flaming jewel, given to her by the god Gilliad, a jewel of tremendous power. But the tale of Gilliad and Chavella is an old myth, just a fable," said Rinbon in a dismissive tone. "A fable for you, perhaps, but a reality for us," replied Roland. "The Flame of Gilliad is real. The god Gilliad gave it to his first congregation as a gift. For 1,000 generations, the priests of Gilead have been tasked with keeping it safe and secret. And over the centuries, there has always been a girl who has borne the jewel within her, and that girl has always been named Chavella. The first Chavella was chosen by the god Gilead to house the stone, in essence to be a living temple. And from then on, as the old Chavella died, a new Chavella was chosen at birth to carry the flaming jewel. The Flame of Gilliad is a source of great power, and is only used in times of great need and only for good. But men have always sought it, driven by a lust for power and greedy ambitions. In the wrong hands, it can only spell doom for the world. And now we priests of Gilead come before you because 2 nights ago Chavella was abducted, and our high priest of Anar was murdered by the necromancer and high priest Zuthal Ka." At the mention of that name, Rinbon gave a start. "Zuthal Ka?" he exclaimed. "You know of him?" asked Sabian. I know of him," answered the thief. "And no more dangerous an enemy could you have. His dark temple is on the far side of the city. They say that it is an abode for demons, and that Zuthal Ka is not a man but a devil in human guise. Others claim that he is just a madman with an unquenchable lust for power. But pray tell, how is it that you came looking for me?" The 2 priests shared a quick look, and Sabian replied, "We communed with our god, and he instructed that we should seek your aid. After all, you have the distinction of being called the Prince of Thieves." Rinbon chuckled. "'Tis a label I have not branded on myself, but a title that others have bestowed upon me. I make no such claims." "Howbeit," said the priest, "if there is anyone who can steal Chavella from the coils of that serpent, it is you. And it must be done this very night. If Zuthal Ka succeeds in taking the jewel from her, the world will suffer a terrible fate." "Tonight, you say? Well, that gives me little time to prepare." He then took a swallow of his wine and leveled a hard gaze at the 2 priests. "And what, pray tell, am I to be paid for this rescue?" queried the thief. The eyes of both priests went suddenly downcast, as if in shame. "We have naught to offer in the way of gold or silver coin," said Sabian. "We are but humble priests." He then raised his eyes to Rinbon, a look of desperation on his face. "Your reward will be knowing that you prevented a terrible evil and saved Chavella." Rinbon sat silent for a moment, musing, his stoic face giving no hint as to what he was thinking. Though he was a thief and a trickster extraordinaire, he was a practical man with a streak of morality, however small. And if he felt strongly enough, he could be swayed to champion a cause, though typically he was compensated handsomely for any services he rendered. Rinbon knew that if Zuthal Ka succeeded in gaining the jewel, he could use its powers to seize control of the city of Kem and beyond. The thought of that fiend ruling the city where he lived and thrived was infuriating. With that devil in charge, everything would change, and Rinbon liked things just the way they were. "It is no easy task that you ask of me," he said finally. to crawl into that unholy house of devils? It is a place that is shunned, and by all accounts for good reason. But I am inclined to believe that what you say is truth." He then paused and took a long swill from his wine-jug. Setting it down, he wiped his lips with the back of his hand and said, "To the 9 hells with Zuthal Ka! A man can only die but once, and I have never balked from an adventure just because it was dangerous." "Then you will help us?" said Roland with a smile and a jubilant look in his eyes. "Aye," replied the thief. "What choice do we have? We cannot let that sorceress dog have the jewel, or your lady Chavella." "But how will you get into that evil place?" asked Sabian. "Getting into the temple is not what troubles me," replied the thief. "That is but a trifle. So great is the fear of Zuthal Ka that none but his disciples dare enter of that forbidden shrine. Nay, getting in will be easy. It's getting out that may prove to be more of a problem." 4. A slumberous quiet, like that which settles over a long-forgotten tomb, lay over the temple of Baal. This silence only served to intensify an almost palpable sense of menace that seemed to emanate from its dark stone walls. Hidden in the shadows, Rinbon eyed the brooding structure. Etched against the backdrop of a clear starlit night, it looked especially sinister. To Rinbon, the circular building with its domed top and 8 marble columns reminded him of a great black spider poised to pounce upon its victim. Near the temple were the remains of older structures built long ago when the city of Kem was young. These buildings were now little more than piles of rubble. It was here, hidden among the shadows, that Rinbon surveyed his surroundings. As he expected, his keen eyes spotted no guards. Such was the temple's fearsome reputation that none but the disciples of Baal would dare enter. Yet there was something odd. Rinbon had passed by the temple on occasion, and ordinarily it was bustling with activity. This was particularly prevalent at night, when its purple-robed worshippers came to pay homage to their demon god. But on this night the wide bronze doors, covered with an arabesque of esoteric symbols, were closed, and only a few of the building's windows showed any light. Perhaps, thought Rinbon, Zuthal Ka was too busy with Chavella to be bothered by his congregation. As luck would have it, there was only a crescent sliver of moon, and the shadows were thick. Like an apparition, he passed the front of the temple, and turned down a stinking, refuse-scattered alley. This he traversed until he came to an iron-barred window set in the temple's stone wall. Rinbon had broken into temples before, and knew that most of them followed the same basic floor plan. Knowing this, he felt sure that this was a cellar window and would be a good point of entrance. This was a far different man than the one who, only hours before, was swilling wine and tossing dice with friends. Gone were the golden rings and jewel-encrusted sword with its ivory hilt and polished, silver-worked scabbard. Those flashy accoutrements were fine for a night of carousing, but now he was Rinbon the thief, and everything about him was done with an economical purpose. The fine, handcrafted silk clothing he had worn earlier had been replaced with an outfit of soft leather that had been dyed jet black. Under his shirt was a coat of stout chainmail armor that was oiled to keep it quiet. Around his waist was a girdle of cloth, instead of the bulky, silver-buckled belt he had worn earlier. From this girdle hung a sword and dagger, both of exceptional craftsmanship, but devoid of any jewels or gems that might sparkle and give away his position. Even his mannerisms had changed. Now his eyes were watchful, and his wolf-like faculties were on full alert. Standing before the barred window, Rinbon reached into a leather pouch and brought forth a small glass vial of silvery liquid that glimmered faintly. Removing the cork stopper, he sprinkled a few drops at the base of each of the 4 iron bars. Instantly there was a wisp of smoke where the liquid had come in contact with the bars. A second later they began to glow red and melt as if they had been superheated in a blacksmith's forge. Rinbon smiled faintly as he watched the metal flow apart like liquid lava. It was a rare potion that he had filched, the purloining of which was so daring that it alone would have made him a legend among thieves, had he not already enjoyed that distinction. Replacing the precious liquid into his pouch, Rinbon gripped the melted bars, and with an effort was able to bend them far enough apart to allow access through the opening. A moment later, he wriggled his way through and lowered himself onto the dirt floor of a basement. It was dark, but just enough moonlight filtered in that his sharp eyes could make out the vague form of stairs leading up to a door. Ascending the steps, he stood before the door and quietly lifted the iron latch. Pushing it open just a little, he peered out into a dark hallway that branched off to the left and right. From the right, he could see a faint, eerie orange glow of light, while the left passageway remained shrouded in darkness. Drawing his sword, Rinbon glided down the hallway that branched to the right, making no more sound than a stalking panther. At the end, he peered around the corner. Before him was a long corridor lined with ivory doors and lit by flickering candles perched in wall-mounted sconces of wrought iron. Warily, Rinbon advanced down the dim hallway until he came to its end. Cautiously, he peered around another corner and spotted the large bronze doors that were the temple's main entrance. Directly across from those doors, on the other side of the corridor, were two more doors also made of heavy bronze. These were open wide, and Rinbon knew that they led into the temple's main worship room. A few stealthy steps brought Rinbon to the opening of the room. For a moment he stood listening intently, but no sounds issued from the cella. Carefully he spared a look, and what he saw was a scene straight out of nightmare and lunacy. He stared into a large, richly furnished room with a high domed ceiling that disappeared into inky blackness. Its walls were festooned with gold and purple tapestries covered in cryptic hieroglyphs and symbols of pentagrams, hexagrams, and pyramids, with great eyes at their centers. Strange writings surrounded by 8-pointed symbols of chaos covered some of the hangings, while others showed a liturgy of red-robed figures worshipping horrific horned devils with slavering jaws agape. Well-traveled as he was, Rinbon had never seen such a bizarre and disturbing display of evil. This, he thought to himself, was indeed the very house of hell. Off to his left, he glimpsed a plush divan, covered in purple velvet and strewn with plump silken cushions. Next to that, a golden throne-like chair with a high back rested on a raised marble dais with 4 steps leading up to it. Near the chair were huge brass candelabras, intricately fashioned into the likeness of great intertwining serpents, their heads pointing upward with fanged mouths agape. Inside those yawning jaws long candles were placed, flickering vividly. Rinbon's eyes then went to the gigantic carven idol of the malformed and bloated demon god Baal. Resting on a raised stage and wrought of black marble that shone dully in the firelight, its presence dominated the room. Hideously the demon squatted, its diabolical face leering down and its clawed hands and great bat-like wings spreading wide. On either side of Baal stood 2 gleaming brass braziers that burned with bright orange flames. These fires cast long black shadows on the walls and tapestries that writhed and danced like phantoms imbued with salacious life. Below the squatting god rested the great iron and bronze altar of Baal, its surface covered in cryptic symbols. Rinbon could clearly see the dark stains of blood that ran down the sides from the countless victims that had perished there. At that sight, an involuntary shudder went through him as he thought of those poor souls. His gaze then went to the figure of a woman fettered upon that sacrificial table, and he knew that it was Chavella. His first impulse was to rush to her, but he hesitated, not daring to cross the threshold into that malevolent room. He had been in too many perilous situations to miss the subtle warning signs of danger. What malignant menace lurked in that demonic, shadow-filled chamber he could not guess, but his razor-sharp instincts screamed that it was a trap. And where was Zuthal Ka? He had seen no sign of the priest. For a moment more he hesitated, and then, gripping his sword tightly, he stepped onto the mosaic floor. Rinbon had put his life in jeopardy too many times to hesitate now. Always before, his skill and uncanny luck had seen him through. Wary as a wolf, Rinbon strode across the room, poised to fight or flee in an instant. At any moment, he expected the sudden rush of robed acolytes brandishing raised daggers, but no attack came. Presently, he stood before the priestess and gazed down at her. Disheveled though she was, with her night tunic and robe stained and torn, she was still a breathtaking beauty. A luxuriant mass of golden blonde hair framed a regal face, with a delicate nose and full, voluptuous pink lips. Rinbon had known many women in his time, from buxom, sultry-eyed tavern wenches to royal courtesans and choice ladies of a king's seraglio, but never had he looked upon such a majestic masterpiece of beauty. As if sensing his presence, her eyes suddenly flickered open, flashing like blue crystals in the light of the fire. For a moment it was as if she were coming out of a deep lethargy, and then she focused her gaze on the thief and asked in a weak voice, "Who are you?" "I am Rinbon," he replied, as he stared into the radiant beauty of those dazzling eyes. "Rinbon," she said incredulously. "I have heard of you. They say you are the Prince of Thieves. But how is it that you are here, and why?" "Your priest friend Sabian sent me in to fetch you." "Sabian," she said with a start. "He is here?" "Aye, back in the city." Rinbon then gave her a hard look. "Where is Zuthal Ka?" "I do not know," she replied. "But I fear that you are too late. That fiend has taken the Flame of Gilliad from me. By his black magic he was able to break my mind and force me to conjure the jewel. I tried to fight him. Oh, how I tried!" she said as she began to sob uncontrollably. "But he was too strong." "Well, at least I will get you out of the devilish house and worry about the jewel later." Rinbon then pulled from his leather belt pouch a slim hook-like tool made of smooth metal. "I am going to open your shackles. The front doors are—" Rinbon's words were suddenly cut off by a booming laughter that was as humorless as the low growl of a wolf. Quick as a cat, Rinbon wheeled about, raising his sword. To his surprise, two men suddenly materialized from thin air, where moments before there had been none. "Magic," spat Rinbon. "I might have known." Seated on the golden throne was a man in a richly embroidered robe of dark red. He regarded Rinbon with a baleful look from his dark, upward-slanted eyes. By his looks, Rinbon took the man to be of an Eastern descent, and he knew without being told that he was Zuthal Ka. "Welcome, Rinbon," said the man in a strange accent. "It is an honor to have such a distinguished guest in my house. I have heard the poem and stories of your adventures, and have enjoyed them immensely," he said, smiling. And in no way did that thin-lipped smile extend to his eyes. If Zuthal Ka had hoped to shock the thief by knowing who he was, he failed. It was no surprise to Rinbon that a sorcerer would know his name or who he was. Such was the ways of wizards. "So, you must be Zuthal Ka." And as he spoke, Rinbon stepped away from the altar and Chavella. He knew the only way out of the temple was to fight, and he wanted to give himself room to maneuver. "Indeed," answered the priest, "and this is Balto," he said, motioning with his hand to a man reclining casually on the velvet divan. "You will have to forgive Balto. He is not much for words. His talents lie in other areas." Rinbon spared a glance at the man. Seated on the plush couch was a giant of a man, dark-skinned and naked save for a loincloth and high-strapped sandals. A long mane of tousled black hair topped his massive head, and under his low, broad forehead a set of brooding dark eyes regarded the thief menacingly. In sheer size the man was enormous, with great sweeping shoulders, a thick bull neck, and limbs that bulged with great corded muscles. He eyed Rinbon with a casual indifference as his fingers closed around the haft of a great double-bladed war-axe that leaned against a nearby table. "I must say, you are brazen," said Zuthal Ka. "Did you really think to come into my house and steal my prize without me knowing?" He then glanced at Chavella. "She is a rare beauty, to be sure, but I know all that happens in my temple. And as you already know, you are too late. I have the Flame of Gilliad. With my sorcery, I have taken the jewel and from her mind its secrets." He then pulled from inside his robe a great crimson jewel. Rinbon had never seen anything quite like it. About the size of a man's fist and oval in shape, it pulsed and shimmered with an uncanny red luminosity. Chavella let out a gasp at the sight of the blazing jewel, and Rinbon tightened the grip on his sword. "Tell me, Rinbon, why would you risk your life to rescue Chavella, a priestess? You are a bloody-handed thief and a rogue. What care you if I have the jewel, or if a priestess lives or dies?" "Aye, a rogue I am," agreed Rinbon. "But even a rogue knows not to give power to a madman such as you." "Perhaps you are right," said Zuthal Ka as he stared into the depth of the pulsing stone. "Or perhaps I am the only one with enough power and ambition to possess it." His gaze then returned to Rinbon. "Why not forsake this venture that would only result in your demise and join me? I could use one such as you to great effect. The riches and rewards that you would reap would be far greater than all that you have thus far achieved." "I would sooner partner with a hell-spawned demon than a dog such as you," spat Rinbon contemptuously. Zuthal Ka's gaze hardened at Rinbon's scornful reply. "Then there was nothing more to discuss," he said with finality. "In a way, it is sad that you must die. To think that there will be no more songs and poems of your deeds is a great pity. But alas, every man dies, even the great ones." And without taking his eyes off Rinbon, he said, "Balto, kill Rinbon," as casually as if he were telling a dog to fetch a stick. With a grunt, the giant rose, hefting his great axe, and like a maddened bull he charged. With a speed that belied his great size, he came on swiftly, the massive corded muscles of his arms and shoulders swelling as he raised his gleaming axe. Rinbon, as immobile as a statue, made no attempt to avoid that rush. Instead, it was only when the great axe was humming down that he moved, and when he did, it was with the blinding speed of a striking leopard. By a hair's breadth he dodged the bladed death that streaked towards him, and his sword flashed out like a stroke of lightning. For the blink of an eye the blade transfixed the giant's throat, a portion of the tip protruding out the other side, and in a flash it was gone. Balto, staring at Rinbon in shock and disbelief, faltered, his axe dropping to the marble floor with a clang from nerveless fingers. Clutching his throat as he spurted blood, the giant took 2 steps back and with a gurgling groan fell heavily to the floor and died. Without so much as a glance at Balto, Zuthal Ka rose from his throne. "Well done," he said as he descended the marble steps to the mosaic floor to stand before Rinbon. "I have seen 100 men fall before Balto's axe, and I must admit that I had some doubts that you would not fall. But I see now that the songs and stories ring true. You are as great as they boast." Zuthal Ka then looked at the jewel that he held. "Easy would it be for me to kill you with sorcery," he said arrogantly, "but that would not be a fitting death for one such as you. You are a man who lives by the sword, and thus you deserve to die in battle." Rinbon made no reply as he watched his enemy from slitted eyes that smoldered like that of a trapped animal. Zuthal Ka then placed the pulsating stone on the table near the divan and unclasped his voluminous robe, letting it fall to the floor. Though not a large man, he was splendidly built, and the white silken shirt he wore could not conceal the hard-edged lines of his muscular frame. From his hip hung a long, slightly curved sword in a lacquered wooden scabbard. This he drew, and in a voice that rang with conceit he said, "Prince of Thieves, you look upon an Eastern swordsman from the land of the Chenzen. Long before I delved into the dark arts and became a priest of Baal, I was a fighting man. Nowhere in the world will you find warriors that are more steeped in the lore of swordcraft than in the East. The skill of the Chenzen is beyond the belief of common man, and they are the greatest swordsmen in the world. From the time a child of Chenzen can wield a sword, they are trained to slay with the naked blade. Since the days of my childhood, I was taught by the great sword masters. But it was only after I had proven myself in battle that I was given the honor of being taught by Master Tumoto. Only the most exceptional are bestowed the privilege of becoming his pupil, and I was the most exceptional of all. Why I left those eastern lands is no concern of yours. In a moment you will be beyond the need to know." And with a movement as fluid and graceful as a dancer, Zuthal Ka sprang at Rinbon. Expecting the attack, the thief was ready when it came. With a deft move he blocked the blade and cut back viciously at Zuthal Ka's face. The priest ducked under the slash, and in an instant the two were a blinding blur of shimmering swords. Such was their skill and speed that no human eye could follow the whirlwind of lightning-fast sword strokes. Chavella, watching from the altar, involuntarily held her breath. And as the two swordsmen fought, the ringing of their blades echoed off the stone walls, and their shadows joined the other in an eerie dance. Fighting as he had never fought before, Rinbon had to call upon every ounce of skill he possessed just to survive Zuthal Ka's inhuman onslaught. Already he bled from half a dozen superficial cuts on his arms and legs, but thus far his quick reflexes and chainmail armor had kept him from any serious damage. Yet he knew that he had to end the fight quickly, or he would fall. He could not avoid that lethal blade forever, and any normal man would have already died. Redoubling his effort, Rinbon forced the attack, and for the first time his sword cut a red swath across the priest's chest. With a look of shock and pain, Zuthal Ka glowered at Rinbon, and in that instant both men sensed a turning point in the fight. From there, Rinbon set his jaw, and with the unbridled ferocity of a lion he brought the battle to his enemy, his blade flashing like blue hellfire. Rinbon did not possess the sophisticated teachings that Zuthal Ka had. His fighting style was natural and as elemental as that of a wolf. His craft had not been learned from a teacher, but from 1,000 fights in tavern brawls, dark alleys, and on the decks of ships that ran red with blood. And inexorably his natural swordsmanship began to win out against the more refined craft of his opponent. Against the ferocity of that assault, Zuthal Ka began to falter, and begrudgingly gave ground. Seeing that the priest was weakening both physically and mentally, a grim smile came to Rinbon's lips. And for the first time in his life, Zuthal Ka knew that he had met his match. A sudden fear showed in his dark eyes as he narrowly parried a lightning-fast thrust. Beads of sweat were rolling down his face, and his breathing was labored. And still Rinbon came on, fighting as savagely as a wild beast. Then, above the ringing and clashing of swords, there was a sharp outcry. Shearing through flesh and bone, Rinbon had plunged his blade to the hilt in Zuthal Ka's chest, just below the heart. As the priest gasped for breath and dropped his sword, Rinbon brought his face close and stared full into those Stygian eyes. "You arrogant fool," he said in a low voice. "I think maybe you never crossed swords with a man from the West before. Hell, kill a few of us before you make claims of how great you are. I've done it more times than I can count." And with a savage wrench, Rinbon tore his bloody sword free of the priest's body, watching as he collapsed in his death throes. He then wiped the glistening beads of sweat from his brow and rested for a moment to catch his breath. For all his scorn of Zuthal Ka's skills, Rinbon knew he was lucky to have survived. The Easterner had been the most formidable swordman he had ever faced. Turning his back on the dying priest, Rinbon hurriedly went to Chavella. Recovering his pick tool that he discarded earlier, he dexterously began picking the locks that secured the priestess, and in no time she was free of her shackles. "Come on," he said as he lifted the weakened girl to her feet. "We had better get out of here. By morning this place will be crawling with fanatics. If Zuthal Ka's followers find us here, they will kill us for sure. And don't forget your bauble." "Is he dead?" asked Chavella. "Aye, tonight that black-hearted devil sleeps in hell." It was then that Charvella's blue eyes suddenly went wide and she shrieked. "Rinbon! Zuthal Ka! He lives!" she said, pointing, her eyes full of fright. Rinbon wheeled like a jungle cat, brandishing his sword. He could see that with the last ounce of his waning strength, the priest had dragged himself across the floor, trailing a long red smear of blood. Presently he was at the table where he had placed the jewel, and with a bloody hand he reached out and grasped the crimson stone. Instantly he was swathed in a bright red glow that covered his entire body. Rinbon, cursing an oath, sprang towards the priest, his sword raised. But he was too late. Zuthal Ka's blood-covered hand lifted, and he uttered a strange mystic word. Instantaneously, Rinbon was frozen as if he were a solid piece of immovable stone. Fighting against the spell with all his might, the veins in his temples stood out purply, and his muscles seemed ready to burst with his effort to move. Unable to break the incantation, Rinbon watched as Zuthal Ka rose from the floor, the blazing jewel pulsing in his left hand. Turning, he spotted his sword, and suddenly the blade leapt as if of its own volition, like a living thing to the priest's outstretched hand. Though still covered in fresh blood, Rinbon could see that the gushing wound on Zuthal Ka's chest had closed, as if it had never been there. The sorcerer then lowered a venomous gaze at Rinbon, and in a wrathful voice said, "Behold the power of the Flame of Gilliad! With it I will become a god, and tonight it will be you who sleeps in hell." And with a savage thrust, Zuthal Ka drove his long sword through Rinbon's body. Instantly the spell that held the thief was broken, and he collapsed to the floor with a groan, blood flowing freely from the great wound. As Rinbon fell, Chavella cried out in despair, and Zuthal Ka turned and approached her, his eyes burning like black coals of fire. "You had all this might at your fingertips," he said in a voice full of disdain, "yet you never choose to wield it. Such a waste." "I did wield it," retorted Chavella proudly and defiantly despite her terror. "Just not in the way you would wield it." "It matters little," said Zuthal Ka as he gazed deeply into the depths of the crimson gem with a crazed look in his eyes and pupils dilated. "With this power I will become a god even greater than Gilead." Drunk with power, he stared upon the jewel as a madman stares. "It is mine," said he, "to do as I choose." And with an evil maniacal laugh, he touched the great jewel to Charvella's chest, and her eyes suddenly went wide as she let out a shriek and dropped lifeless at Zuthal Ka's feet. Holding the glowing gem, he laughed wickedly as he watched her fall. It was in that instant that the air in the room suddenly became supercharged with electricity, as if from an impending thunderstorm. This was followed by a great wind like a tornado that rushed about, causing the conflagration of flames in the braziers to blaze brightly and roar wildly. Zuthal Ka, awakened from his mad ravings, looked about, a sudden fear growing in his dark eyes. And then there came a tearing, electrical sound, as if the very fabric of time and space was being ripped asunder. A moment later, suspended in mid-air, there appeared a dense black circle that pulsed with strange radiations and was fringed with shards of brilliant flashes of blue and white energy. And as the priest watched, the circle expanded, and before his bewildered eyes, stars and planets and galaxies could be seen. It was a great opening that bridged the vast gulfs of the cosmos. And through this galactic doorway there stepped a colossal man, unlike any earthly man. Garbed in a shimmering silver robe, he was towering in height. His face was of an unnatural and unearthly beauty. His hair was long and white as bone, and his brilliant eyes shone and sparkled like blue topaz crystals. Zuthal Ka, still clutching the crimson jewel, reeled back in utter terror and fell to the floor. All of his arrogant bravado had vanished. Rinbon, gazing upon the being, wondered if indeed he had died or was mad with delirium. For a moment there was only the sound of the swirling, rushing wind and the crackle of raw energy, and then there was only the sound of silence. The being turned his head and gazed upon the cowering priest, and in a voice that resounded with a metallic-like resonance it spoke. "Zuthal Ka, of the Temple of Baal, I am Gilliad. From across the vastness of the multiverse and plains undreamed of by man I have come, for you have invoked my name, and your blasphemous deeds have roused my ire." In his temple, Zuthal Ka was omnipotent, but before the might of Gilead he shrunk back in absolute terror, his eyes full of fright, his body trembling. As Gilead gazed upon Zuthal Ka, his radiant blue eyes suddenly went as red as a lurid flame, and his beautiful face showed anger. "Long have I watched you," said Gilead. "You have grown in power by the suffering of the innocent, and long have I desired to put an end to your vile sacrilegious deeds. But naught could I do to intervene, for rarely do the paths of gods and men intersect. But you have desecrated my sacred house of worship and murdered the most precious of my votaries." Stepping forward, Gilead loomed over the cowering priest, and his anger was terrible and frightening to behold. "And mighty have you become in your sorcerous arts on this world of man. But know this, mortal," and Gilead's voice rose in volume like a crack of thunder, "as insignificant as a single star is to the vastness of the cosmos, so your powers are to the might of a god." And with a gesture of his hand, the great jewel was torn from Zuthal Ka's gripping fingers. Like a streak of crimson fire it sped and landed gently on Gilead's upturned palm. Paralyzed with fear, all Zuthal Ka could do was watch as Gilead pointed the gem at him. And suddenly there was a blinding burst of red light, and like a flame leaps, a beam of red light leapt out and engulfed the screaming priest. For a fleeting moment he cried out in terrible anguish and thrashed about in the throes of great pain, and then, with a flash of red brilliance, he was gone. Gilead turned to Chavella, and the lurid red glow of his eyes faded and returned to blue. Kneeling, he placed the jewel on Chavella's chest, where it was absorbed into her body. He then looked at Rinbon. "Lament not, O man, the flame will give her breath once again. Yet though your own lifeblood flows from you, I cannot save you. That choice will be left up to her." Gilead then rose and strode to the cosmic doorway, and stepping through, was gone in an instant. Rinbon lay silent. His breathing was shallow, and his consciousness was beginning to fade into darkness as the wound on his side spilled his lifeblood. Yet before the eternal darkness overtook him, a sudden movement from Chavella caught his attention. Looking, he could see that she had raised herself to a seated position. Seeing the stricken thief, she sprang to her feet and rushed to his side. Holding out her hand, the great jewel suddenly appeared, vibrant and pulsing. She then pressed it to the terrible wound, and instantly it closed. A second later, Rinbon felt a great rush of vitality and strength returning to him, flowing through his body like a tidal wave, and the darkness faded and all became clear before his eyes. Climbing to his feet, he gazed at the jewel. "It's a good thing you had that. Another minute and I would have joined Zuthal Ka in hell." Rinbon then grabbed her hand. "Let's get out of here." She resisted and said, "There is one thing I must do before we leave." She faced the idol of Baal. The demon god seemed to leer at her evilly. Gripping the flame of Gilliad, she held it before the statue and closed her eyes. The jewels seemed to pulse faster and blaze brighter. Suddenly there was a loud grating sound, and the great stone idol began to sway drunkenly. It then toppled over and fell to the floor with a deafening crash, shattering into 100 pieces. Chavella opened her eyes, and the jewel vanished, seeming to sink into her hand. Without a word, the two fled from the temple of Baal and into the nighttime streets of the city. A short time later, as the golden rays of the sun began to wipe away the night, Rinbon bid farewell to Sabian, Roland, and Chavella. Eager to get back to their church, they had readied their horses shortly after being reunited, and were determined to leave at first light. Standing before the alehouse where just a few hours before his adventure had begun, Rinbon watched as the 3 priests prepared to depart. "We can never truly repay you," said Sabian as he swung himself into the saddle of his horse. "Yes," agreed Roland as he smiled at Rinbon from atop his steed, "and we are forever indebted to you." Chavella paused before mounting her mare and approached Rinbon. Staring up at him, her radiant blue eyes showed a hint of sadness. "I want to thank you before we leave," she said. "If it wasn't for you, much would have been lost." And without warning, she embraced him. Caught off guard by the display of affection, he somewhat clumsily returned the embrace. Pulling away, she said, "I understand from what Sabian and Roland have told me that you did this without being paid. I also understand that a man like you is usually compensated well for his services." "Aye," replied Rinbon, "but sometimes there are things that are more important than gold or gems." "Well," said Chavella, "I have sworn myself to a life of service in the clergy, and have no need of wealth, and have nothing to give you, save this." She then unclasped a slender chain of gold from around her supple neck, and pulled from underneath her shirt an amulet with a strange red gem that shone with an unnatural light. This she handed to Rinbon, saying, "I have had this since I was born. Each Chavella is given one at birth. It is a gift from Gilead." "Such a rare treasure," remarked Rinbon as he admired the amulet appreciatively. Save for the Flame of Gilliad, Rinbon had never looked upon a gem quite like it. "Are you sure you want to give it to one such as me?" he asked with a grin. "It is mine to do with as I choose," she replied with a smile, and her vibrant blue eyes beamed. She then climbed atop her horse and gathered the reins. With a last look, she said, "Farewell, Rinbon, Prince of Thieves," as she turned and galloped off, followed by her companions. Later that evening found Rinbon at his favorite alehouse recounting the events of his previous night's adventure. In front of a motley throng of ruffians, he recounted in great detail his fight with Zuthal Ka, and how the god Gilead had arrived to kill the priest and save Chavella. When the narration was done, most of the men could hardly believe such a fantastical tale, even from one as renowned as Rinbon. So they jested and joked and roared with mirth at his expense. "'Tis a great tale you tell," remarked a hairy, one-eyed pirate, the tone of his gravelly voice clearly showing his good-natured skepticism. "But even from you it is hard to believe." "Aye," agreed a quick-eyed cutpurse with a long, jagged scar that ran down the side of his face. "How can we be sure that such an incredible story is true?" "Mayhap we should go knock on Zuthal Ka's door and ask if he's home," suggested a wiry pirate with sun-darkened skin. His remark was followed by more boisterous laughter. Rinbon, taking no offense from their good-natured jibes, filled his jeweled goblet with wine from a huge jug. He then took a long drink and smiled broadly as he wiped his lips with the back of his hand. "Word will spread soon enough of Zuthal Ka's death," he said. "But until then, mayhap this will convince you." From his leather belt pouch he drew forth an object that he set upon the wine-stained tabletop. and before the bedazzled eyes of the men was an amulet of gold set with a blazing red gem that shone with an uncanny radiance. As one, the men gasped, and all that gazed upon its dazzling beauty knew that its origins were not of this world.